I had always loved mornings at my little cabin by the lake. There's something about the still water, the sound of birds chirping, and the way the sun reflects off the ripples that makes life feel simple. Most people spend hours commuting, stuck in traffic, chasing deadlines. Me, I had a coffee in one hand, a fishing rod in the other, and the world seemed to pause just for me. It was a Saturday morning, and I had planned nothing more ambitious than catching a few fish and maybe fixing the old dock that had been wobbling since last winter. I was halfway through my first sip of coffee, staring at the mist hovering over the lake when my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number at first. A quick glance at the screen made me frown. Notice of violation, unauthorized use of lake property. I nearly spat out my coffee. Unauthorized use of my lake. I blinked a few times, thinking maybe it was a prank or perhaps some bureaucratic mistake. My lake, my dock, my fishing spot. For the past decade, this was my little sanctuary, and apparently, according to whoever sent this email, it wasn't mine. I opened the email carefully, reading every line. It was formal, threatening, and honestly ridiculous. They claimed I was using a lake that supposedly belonged to the HOA. They cited rules, fines, and legal jargon that made my head spin. There was even a figure mentioned, a fine so steep it could make anyone choke on their morning coffee. At first, I laughed out loud. I laughed while my dog tilted his head, probably wondering if I had finally lost it. Surely this was a joke. Maybe one of my neighbors was messing with me. The timing, though too perfect, this wasn't a prank. The sender's name was crystal clear, HOA Karen, and if there's one thing you learn quickly about HOA Karen, it's that she takes everything personally. For the first few minutes, I just stared at the email, imagining her sitting in some immaculate office, polishing her nails, and counting imaginary fines like a villain in a soap opera. Ah yes, I pictured her muttering to herself, I shall finally get him to obey the rules of the HOA. Nobody disrespects me in my lake. But as the initial laughter faded, a creeping sense of unease settled in. What if this wasn't a mistake? What if she actually believed this lake belonged to her, or rather, that she had some sort of authority over it? I had always known Karen was the type who measured her neighbor's hedges with a ruler at 3 a.m., but this was a whole new level of absurd. I took a deep breath and decided the best course of action was to ignore it. After all, what could she do? Send another email? Threaten a fine? I was the lake owner and I'd always played by the law. Right? Still, something about the tone of the message gnawed at me. It wasn't just bureaucratic, it was personal. I tried to shake it off and went about my morning. The coffee was warm, the breeze was gentle, and I even managed to catch a small bass. For a moment, life felt normal again. But just as I reeled in my second fish, a new thought crept in, one that made my stomach tighten. This wasn't just about fines, this was about control. And Karen, in all her glory, had a way of escalating things beyond reason. I glanced at the dock and thought about the hours I had spent fixing it. The memories of summer nights, fireworks over the water, friends laughing, and kids splashing, none of that was hers. It was mine, my property, my sanctuary, my peace. And the more I thought about it, the more determined I became. That day, I didn't know it yet, but this little email from HOA Karen was the opening salvo in a battle I hadn't asked for. The quiet mornings by the lake, the gentle lapping of water, the serene solitude, all of that was about to be disrupted by someone who believed rules were made to enforce her ego. I finished my coffee, grabbed my fishing gear, and walked down to the dock, staring at the water. Somewhere in the distance, I could almost see Karen, clipboard in hand, imagining herself as the ruler of my little paradise. I smiled to myself and whispered, "All right, Karen, if you want a war over my lake, you just found one." And with that, the calm morning ended. What started as a peaceful Saturday was about to turn into one of the most absurd, stressful, and truth be told, entertaining battles of my life. I didn't have to wait long for the next sign that HOA Karen wasn't just sending emails, she was taking this personally. A few days later, I was leaning against the railing of my dock, enjoying the late morning sun, when I noticed a bright flash of pink approaching from the gravel driveway. My heart sank before I even realized why. There she was, Karen in full HOA warrior mode. Pink blazer, sunglasses perched on her nose, clipboard in hand like a shield. I swear, she looked like she had just stepped out of some corporate drama scene, ready to enforce the rules of the universe single-handedly. "Good morning," I called, trying to sound casual, hoping maybe she would leave after a quick chat. Karen didn't smile. She never smiles when she's about to deliver bad news, or in this case, threats. "You need to stop using this lake immediately," she said, her voice sharp, almost like a whistle. "This property is part of the HOA and you are in violation. You've been issued fines, and if you don't comply, further action will be taken." I blinked. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. "This is my property, the lake, the dock, the cabin, it's mine. I've owned it for over a decade." Karen lifted an eyebrow, the classic "I don't believe you" expression that she seemed to practice in front of mirrors for hours. "Ownership records don't matter when it comes to HOA rules," she said, tapping the clipboard for emphasis. "The lake is considered community property. You are using it without authorization. Fines will continue to accrue." At this point, I felt a mix of disbelief, amusement, and that creeping sense of tension I had first felt when I read her email. I could see the neighbors peeking through their windows, some whispering, others shaking their heads. I imagined their thoughts. "Oh, here we go again, Karen versus reality." "Look," I said, trying to keep things friendly, though inside I was simmering, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I have deeds, maps, and everything else showing that this is my property. I'm happy to show you." She cut me off mid-sentence with a sharp laugh. "Deeds, maps, sweetheart, I don't need to see anything. I have authority, and authority is final. You will stop using the lake." I stared at her, trying not to laugh. Authority? This woman thought wielding a clipboard made her a sovereign ruler over my land. I almost suggested she check her crown in the mirror, but instead I let my silence do the work. She shifted on the dock, clearly expecting me to bow or run away. I stayed put, keeping my calm, which only seemed to frustrate her further. I watched as she jotted something on the clipboard, probably imagining herself as some kind of lake policing hero. Then she dropped the bombshell. "I also have friends in the county office who are backing me up. You don't want to test me, do you?" I forced a smile because what else can you do when someone is this delusional? "Well," I said slowly, "I guess we'll find out." And that's when the real suspense started. Karen didn't storm off like I expected. Instead, she lingered, tapping her pen on the dock. Every second felt longer, like waiting for a storm to hit. My dog, sensing the tension, gave a low whine, looking at me as if to say, "What is this woman doing?" I realized then that this wasn't going to be a simple misunderstanding. Karen had made this personal. She was not just trying to enforce some HOA rule, she was on a mission, and apparently the target was me. So I did what any reasonable person might do when confronted by someone completely unhinged about property rights. I stayed calm, made a mental note of every word, every gesture, and every ridiculous flourish she added to her act. I knew this was the beginning of a long game, and I wasn't about to lose without a fight. Karen finally left, tossing one last warning over her shoulder. "Think carefully, there are consequences." I watched her pink blazer disappear down the driveway, my heart still racing but my mind already working. She thought she had control. She thought I'd back down. But as I looked over the calm waters of my lake, I felt a wave of determination wash over me. She had officially opened the door to a battle I hadn't asked for, but I was ready. And deep down, I knew that showing her who actually owned the lake would be satisfying. After Karen's dramatic visit, I knew ignoring her wasn't an option. She wasn't the type to let something like this slide, and if I wanted my lake, my dock, and my sanity intact, I had to fight back, but I needed proof. Solid, undeniable proof that the lake was mine. I started with the most obvious place, my old files. Years of paperwork were tucked away in a dusty filing cabinet, some of it yellowed, some of it barely legible. Deeds, tax records, surveys, I had most of it, but I needed to be thorough. After all, Karen had a flair for theatrics, and the last thing I wanted was her waving her clipboard and claiming victory because I forgot a paper. As I sifted through the documents, my mind raced. Every map, every signature, every official stamp felt like a piece of a puzzle I was desperate to complete. Some of the surveys were confusing, showing lines and markers that made me question whether my memory of the lake's boundaries was accurate. My confidence wavered for a moment. What if there was a legitimate ambiguity? I shook my head. No, I knew this lake. I had been fishing on it since I was a kid. I knew every curve of the shoreline, every dock post, every hidden cove. Karen might think she could assert control, but she had no idea what she was stepping into. Next, I ventured into the county office. Nothing says suspense like digging through decades-old property records in a fluorescent-lit room filled with dusty filing cabinets and overworked clerks. I found myself squinting at maps printed in tiny fonts, cross-referencing them with deeds that had signatures I could barely read. Each new discovery made my pulse quicken. A deed from the 1970s clearly marked the lake as part of my property. Another survey confirmed it. Piece by piece, the puzzle was coming together. Of course, it wasn't without its challenges. One clerk insisted that the HOA might still have a claim despite what the records said. Another gave me a knowing smirk when I asked about Karen, clearly used to dealing with overzealous HOA presidents. I tried not to laugh as I imagined Karen storming into the office herself, pointing fingers, thinking her threats would impress anyone. I also spoke with some longtime neighbors, folks who had lived around the lake for decades. Each one had stories about my family's ownership, stories about how we maintained the lake, and even about Karen's habit of advising everyone else on what they could and couldn't do in their own yards. These anecdotes added color to my case, though I knew legal proof mattered more than gossip. Still, it was comforting to know that people were quietly rooting for me behind the scenes. By the end of the week, I had built a pile of documents, maps, and sworn statements that felt like a small fortress of evidence. I spread everything out on my dining table, staring at it, trying to imagine Karen's reaction. She had stormed my dock, wielded her authority, and believed she had the upper hand. But here I was, armed with decades of documented proof, ready to expose just how wrong she was. And yet, even with all the evidence, there was a knot of tension in my chest. I knew Karen would not back down easily. She thrived on conflict, and I had no doubt she would find some loophole, or at least try to invent one to keep the fight alive. The suspense of what she might do next hung over me like a storm cloud. I couldn't relax. Every creak of the dock, every ripple on the water, every car driving past the cabin made me glance nervously, imagining Karen making another dramatic entrance. I laughed to myself at how ridiculous it all was. Only Karen could turn a peaceful lake into a battlefield over something that had been mine for decades. Finally, I made a decision. I would confront her, but I would do it on my terms, and I would be ready. The proof was in my hands, the neighbors were quietly on my side, and the county records were clear. Now I just had to figure out the right moment to present it all. As I sat on the dock that evening, looking out over the water, I felt a mixture of anticipation and satisfaction. Karen had thrown the first punch. I had gathered the arsenal, and now the real game was about to begin. The calm mornings were over, but if I played this right, the next time she showed up, the shock would be hers, not mine. And just like that, a lake that had always been a place of peace suddenly felt like the center of a battle I was ready to win, but I knew the suspense was far from over. Karen was clever, persistent, and entirely unpredictable. This fight was just getting started. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and I knew this was going to be intense. I had my evidence organized: deeds, surveys, county maps, even sworn neighbor statements. I carried them like armor, knowing that Karen would come armed with her usual mix of confidence, bluster, and misplaced authority. Walking into the boardroom, I immediately noticed the tension in the air. Karen was already there, seated at the head of the table, clipboard in hand, a look of pure self-satisfaction on her face. The room smelled faintly of coffee and tension, and a few curious neighbors peered in through the doorway. I had the unmistakable feeling that everyone was waiting for the fireworks to start. "Good morning," I said, keeping my voice calm. Karen barely acknowledged me, flipping her clipboard as if preparing to deliver a pre-written judgment. She began immediately. "We're here because this property owner," her eyes narrowed on me, "has been using the lake without authorization. This is a serious violation of HOA rules, and fines have already been issued. The board needs to address this before it escalates further." I could feel the weight of every eye in the room. Karen spoke with authority, but I noticed the slight quivers in her hands, the way she emphasized points that didn't need emphasis. Her theatrics were as predictable as they were absurd. I took a deep breath. "I understand your concerns, but I need to present the evidence showing that this lake and dock are actually part of my property. The deeds, surveys, and records from the county clearly indicate ownership. This isn't a dispute over rules, it's a matter of property law." The room went quiet. Karen's eyes widened, but she quickly masked it with an incredulous laugh. "Property law? Sweetheart, the HOA has authority here. That lake is part of the community. Documents can be misleading." I felt a surge of determination. Misleading or not, the legal documents speak for themselves. I've compiled all relevant records, including surveys from the 1970s and notarized deeds. I've even spoken with long-term neighbors who confirm my ownership history. This isn't just a claim, it's factual evidence. Karen leaned back, smirking as if she had a secret ace up her sleeve. "Even if that's true, there are precedents that give the HOA oversight. You may think this is straightforward, but it is. Rules exist for a reason." I stayed calm, letting my words sink in. Rules are important, but they cannot override ownership. This lake has been my property for decades. The board can verify all of this through county records. I am happy to provide everything necessary for verification. The tension was palpable. Board members exchanged glances. Some whispered quietly, clearly impressed by the evidence I had brought. Karen's confidence, once so dominant, seemed to falter slightly. I noticed a flicker of doubt in her expression, a crack in her armor that gave me hope. The board chair cleared his throat. "We will need to review these documents and verify the claims before making any decision. This matter requires further investigation. No fines will be enforced until the verification is complete. Karen's jaw tightened, her smirk vanished, replaced by a tight-lipped glare. She leaned forward, tapping the table with her fingers, clearly frustrated. I don't agree, but if the board insists, I suppose we must wait. As the meeting adjourned, I could feel the energy shift. Karen may have left the room physically intact, but her authority was shaken. I had presented the evidence calmly, clearly, and without losing my composure, and for the first time, it seemed like the board was on my side, or at least willing to let facts speak. Walking out of the boardroom, I couldn't help but smile. The suspense wasn't over, Karen would not give up easily, but this was a crucial victory. I had turned the tables, showing that her threats and bluster couldn't override documented proof. Back at the cabin, I looked at the lake, feeling a mix of relief and anticipation. Karen's next move was uncertain, and the tension of what she might try next hung over me like a cloud. But for now, the calm lake seemed a little safer, and my dock felt a little more secure. I poured myself a cup of coffee, watching the water ripple in the evening sun. The battle was far from over, but for the first time, I felt in control. And deep down, I knew the next confrontation would be even more intense. Because Karen never quits, and neither do I. After the board meeting, I knew that Karen wasn't done. She might have been temporarily stalled, but she was the kind of person who treated a pause as a countdown to her next move. I needed something indisputable, something that would leave her speechless, and for once I wanted her shock to be real. I called my attorney the next morning, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Lisa who had dealt with more property disputes than I cared to think about. I explained the situation, detailing Karen's visits, her threats, and of course the absurd claim that my lake belonged to the HOA. Don't worry, Lisa said, flipping through the documents I had gathered. You have everything we need. These deeds are solid, the surveys match, and the neighbor statements will only strengthen your case. This isn't just a good argument, you're untouchable on this one. I felt a spark of hope. Untouchable, I repeated. That was the word I needed, but I also knew Karen would throw a tantrum the moment she realized she had no leverage. The next step was to compile the evidence formally. Lisa helped me organize everything: the original deed from the 1970s showing my family's ownership, updated county surveys confirming the property lines, notarized statements from longtime neighbors, and even photographs of the lake and dock over the decades. Every piece of evidence reinforced the same story. This lake wasn't just mine, it had always been mine. Once the package was complete, Lisa advised me to send a formal notice to Karen, including copies of all the documentation with her lawyer CC'd. I hesitated for a moment, imagining Karen receiving the envelope, ripping it open, and reading every word with mounting disbelief. I grinned at the thought. This was about to be fun. A few days later, the envelope arrived at Karen's house. I imagined her opening it in slow motion, first confusion, then anger, a frown, then sheer shock as she scanned the documents. I pictured her muttering, "Impossible, this can't be real." And that was just the beginning. Lisa suggested we also file an official notice with the county office to reaffirm ownership. Within hours, the county had confirmed the records: my lake, my dock, my property. Legally, there was no argument. Karen's claims were null and void. Despite all the evidence, I knew the suspense wasn't over. Karen had a flair for the dramatic, and she wasn't going to quietly accept defeat. I could almost hear her plotting, packing her kitchen in that perfect pink blazer, thinking of ways to twist the rules or intimidate me further. But for the first time, I felt a sense of calm. I had facts, law, and history on my side. Karen had only noise and theatrics. The board, the neighbors, and the county records were all on my side. Her bluff had been called, and the tables had turned completely. That evening, I sat on the dock, watching the sun sink into the water, casting a golden glow across the lake. I let the quiet wash over me, savoring the moment. The suspense had been building for weeks, and now I had the upper hand. The thought of Karen's reaction, shock, frustration, disbelief, made me smirk. But I knew better than to let my guard down. Karen never quit. She was like a storm that always returned, even when the sky seemed calm. I had to be ready for whatever absurd move she might attempt next. And yet there was satisfaction in knowing that I had done everything by the book. I hadn't yelled, I hadn't threatened, and I hadn't lost my temper. Every document, every fact, every sworn statement was proof of my rights. Karen could argue, stomp, and fume all she wanted, but legally she had no ground to stand on. I leaned back, letting the lake's quiet remind me why I fought. It wasn't about proving Karen wrong for the sake of drama. It was about protecting what was mine, preserving the peace I had always found here. For now, I had won a huge battle. The suspense of Karen's next move was still hanging over me, but I felt ready. The lake, my sanctuary, was finally safe for the moment. And deep down, I couldn't wait to see the look on Karen's face when she realized that all her threats, all her bluster, and all her so-called authority had been blown away by something she couldn't control: the truth. I thought the battle might be winding down after the county confirmed my ownership, but I underestimated HOA Karen. If there's one thing she was good at, it was persistence, borderline obsession. Just when I thought the storm had passed, she returned, full of determination and theatrics. It started with her car pulling up the driveway again, pink blazer on, sunglasses reflecting the lake like some villain from a bad movie. I could see the clipboard in her hand, probably filled with notes about next steps and imagined loopholes. My dog growled low in his throat, as if even he knew this confrontation wasn't going to be simple. Karen marched straight to the dock. "I've reviewed the documents," she began, her tone a mix of irritation and false calm. "And while I still maintain the HOA has oversight, I am prepared to escalate this matter if necessary. You don't want to force my hand." I leaned against the railing, trying not to smile. "Karen, I've shown you the deeds, the surveys, the county records, and even neighbor statements. Everything confirms this is my property. You don't get to escalate anything that isn't yours." She waved her hand dramatically, as if dismissing reality. "I can still bring this to court. Rules exist to be enforced. Just because you have papers doesn't mean you're untouchable." I kept my voice calm, letting her ramble. Deep down, I knew her threats were all show. Legally, she had nothing. The suspense was electric. Every moment she lingered on my dock, the tension built. Would she finally explode in frustration? Would she try some ridiculous stunt to intimidate me? I had no idea, but I was ready for anything. She pulled out her phone and started snapping pictures of the lake, the dock, even the small wooden bench where I always sat. "Documentation," she said, as if the photos could magically overturn decades of legal records. I couldn't help but chuckle inside. Karen clearly thought a camera could rewrite history. Then things escalated further. A few neighbors who had been quietly watching from their yards started approaching. Some waved politely, others shook their heads at Karen's theatrics. One of them even called out, "Don't waste your time, he owns that lake." I could see the panic in her eyes starting to grow. The spotlight was no longer on her, everyone was witnessing her losing control. Karen's voice raised, "You think your friends and neighbors can protect you? Authority matters." I took a step closer, keeping my tone steady but firm. "Authority matters when it's real, Karen. County records, legal deeds, and surveys are real, your threats are not." For the first time, I saw her hesitation. The confidence that had carried her through countless HOA disputes wavered. She looked around, realizing that the neighbors were quietly siding with me, witnessing every absurd word, every pointless gesture. The suspense was building like a tightrope stretching across the lake. Any misstep and she would completely lose face. She tried one last maneuver. I will consult the board and escalate to legal counsel. This isn't over." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying her frustration. I let her storm off, watching her stomp to her car, muttering under her breath. A mix of relief and satisfaction washed over me. I knew she might try something else. Karen never truly gave up, but for now she had no power here. The neighbors had seen her theatrics, I had the law on my side, and the lake was secure. I returned to the dock, feeling the calm of the water soothe the tension. The suspense wasn't fully gone. Karen was persistent, but the first real cracks in her armor had appeared. I smiled, imagining her at home, probably drafting her next dramatic email, wondering why her authority had evaporated in front of everyone. For now, I had successfully turned the confrontation into a victory without losing my cool. Karen's bluff had been called, and the neighborhood was quietly cheering behind the scenes. I poured myself a cup of coffee and looked out over my lake. The calm reflected back at me, a stark contrast to the chaos Karen had brought. It was satisfying to know that, despite her threats, all I needed was patience, preparation, and a bit of nerve. Karen may have been relentless, but she couldn't overcome reality, and reality in this case was firmly on my side. The lake was mine, the dock was mine, and even Karen had to admit, at least silently, that she had met her match. But I knew this wasn't the end, just the climax before the final curtain. After Karen's last dramatic exit from my property, I thought I'd have a brief window of peace. I was wrong. What I didn't realize was that the real power of this battle didn't lie in deeds, surveys, or county records, it lay in the community. And slowly but surely, the neighborhood was starting to show its hand. It began with small signs, waves from neighbors as I worked on the dock, thumbs up from people driving by, and friendly smiles from those who had previously stayed neutral. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then subtle whispers began to reach me, conversations through open windows, discreet comments at the local store. Karen's antics were no longer private. Everyone seemed to be watching and everyone had an opinion. One afternoon, as I was fixing a loose board on the dock, Mr. Thompson from down the street walked over. He was a grizzled veteran of the lake, probably older than Karen could even imagine, and he had a twinkle in his eye. "You know," he said, leaning on his cane, "Karen's got a lot of energy, but she's forgotten one thing. People notice when someone's being ridiculous. You've got the neighborhood with you." I grinned. That was exactly what I needed to hear. It wasn't just legal documents anymore, it was the court of public opinion, and I was winning. Word spread quickly. Neighbors started speaking up during HOA meetings, recounting past encounters with Karen, how she had overstepped property lines, fined people for minor landscaping infractions, and generally acted like she owned the entire community. Every story painted the same picture. Karen was self-appointed authority, and her ego had finally collided with reality. The suspense in the neighborhood was palpable. You could feel it in the air every time Karen drove past, clipboard in hand, hopping to intimidate someone. But now people weren't intimidated, they were watching. And with every glare she threw, there were silent nods from neighbors who had quietly begun siding with me. One evening, the county surveyor arrived at my property for final verification. Karen, of course, showed up, clearly hopping to intervene or intimidate him. But as he walked the property, taking measurements and confirming boundaries, the neighbors gathered. I could see the disbelief on her face as the surveyor nodded toward my dock and declared it indisputably mine. Her smirk faltered, replaced by a look of pure panic. It was beautiful, really. Weeks of tension and suspense had led to this moment, Karen's authority crumbling in front of the entire community, and it wasn't just me who noticed it. I could see neighbors whispering, pointing out discrepancies, nodding in approval as the surveyor meticulously documented the boundaries. At one point, Karen tried a desperate tactic. She pulled out her phone to call the HOA board, probably hoping to rally support or complicate matters. But the board had already reviewed my documents, verified the county records, and quietly sided with the facts. Her phone call went unanswered, and I could practically see her frustration building by the second. I stayed calm, watching the storm unfold. The suspense was electric. Every gesture, every muttered complaint from Karen, every approving glance from the neighbors heightened the drama. She had thought she could bully me, intimidate the community, and enforce her will, but reality had a funny way of proving her wrong. By the end of the day, Karen retreated. She drove away, muttering threats and shaking her clipboard, but the neighborhood had seen enough. Their support, once quiet and subtle, had become visible, undeniable, and empowering. The suspense of the battle wasn't over entirely, but the tide had clearly turned. I leaned against my dock, watching the sunset paint the lake in gold and orange. The water was calm, reflecting the sky perfectly, and for the first time in weeks, it felt like my sanctuary again. The neighbors had turned the tide, and Karen had no allies left. I smiled, thinking about how absurdly satisfying this was. Authority, theatrics, and bluster could only go so far, especially when confronted with truth, evidence, and a community ready to stand up for what was right. The suspense of Karen's next move lingered in the air, but I was ready. The final showdown was approaching, and I knew one thing: the lake, my dock, and my peace were safe, for now. And deep down, I relished the thought that Karen's shock at the coming conclusion would be priceless. The morning sunlight glimmered off the lake, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I could breathe without worrying about Karen's next move. But I knew better than to let my guard down completely. She had a flair for dramatic, last-ditch efforts, and I was ready. I had everything prepared: legal documents, surveys, neighbor statements, and the satisfaction of knowing the county had confirmed my ownership. Karen, on the other hand, seemed to be running out of options. Her threats had grown quieter, her visits less frequent, and even her car now seemed to drive by more hesitantly, like a general whose army had deserted him. The final confrontation came sooner than expected. One afternoon, Karen showed up again, dragging along her clipboard like a shield. I was on the dock, mending a small tear in my fishing net, and I watched her approach. She paused at the edge of my property, clearly weighing whether to march right up or retreat. "I've consulted the board," she began, her voice tight, "and well, there are still some questions about your use of the lake." I raised an eyebrow, letting the suspense hang in the air for just a moment. "Questions?" I said slowly. "The board has seen the documents, the county has confirmed the surveys, and the neighbors are witnesses. What questions are left?" Her face tightened, and I could almost hear the gears turning in that overworked mind. She tried one last desperate tactic, pointing at the water as if sheer intimidation could rewrite decades of deeds. I can escalate this. I still have options." I smiled, feeling the thrill of the moment. "Karen, you've had every opportunity to present your case. Every threat, every attempt to intimidate me, every claim you made has been thoroughly addressed. Legally, the lake is mine, the board knows it, the county knows it, and if you'll notice, the neighbors are no longer standing on your side." She sputtered, clearly unprepared for this level of calm defiance. Her usual theatrics, her confident gestures, dramatic voice, and clipped proclamations faltered. For the first time, Karen seemed genuinely shocked. Her authority had crumbled, and there was nothing left to prop it up. I let the silence stretch. Every second increased the suspense, the quiet hum of the lake amplifying the finality of the moment. Karen's eyes darted around, seeing the neighbors who had quietly gathered behind me, nodding, some smiling politely, some shaking their heads in disbelief. She had misjudged the community's awareness and support, and now it was too late. Finally, she muttered, her voice barely audible, "Fine, you wins." That was it, the words I had been waiting for. No arguments, no threats, no last-minute loopholes. Karen had conceded, not with grace, but with undeniable defeat. I watched her retreat down the driveway, her clipboard drooping at her side, the pink blazer somehow less intimidating than ever. The suspense was over, and peace finally returned to the lake. I could feel the tension melting away as I turned back to the water, my sanctuary restored. Neighbors came over, offering congratulations, smiles, and quiet laughter at the absurdity of Karen's efforts. The sense of community, of standing together against unwarranted authority, felt like a victory far greater than just reclaiming the lake. It was proof that persistence, preparation, and a little patience could overcome even the most stubborn adversary. I sat on the dock, letting the gentle waves lap against the posts, sipping my coffee and reflecting on the ordeal. Karen had tried every trick in the book: emails, fines, threats, dramatic appearances. But the combination of legal proof, neighborhood support, and calm determination had carried the day. There was humor in the absurdity, too. I thought back to her strutting along the dock, snapping photos, waving her arms, and imagining herself as queen of the lake. I smiled, knowing that the best revenge had been subtle: facts, patience, and letting reality speak louder than any theatrics. As the sun dipped lower, painting the lake with golden reflections, I realized that this experience wasn't just about property. It was about standing your ground, trusting the law, and finding allies in the most unexpected places. And for now, HOA Karen's reign of exaggerated authority over my lake was officially over. I looked at the water, breathed in the fresh air, and whispered to myself, finally, peace. The lake, the dock, and the community had been restored. The suspense was gone, the drama concluded, and I could enjoy my sanctuary once again, until, of course, Karen found some new way to challenge it. But for today, victory was sweet, quiet, and entirely satisfying. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.